Hello and welcome into another episode of Lessons in Product Management. I'm your host, John Fontenot, and today we have Dan Balcauski joining us to talk about all things pricing. Dan is a pricing expert, and I'm super excited for you to hear what he has to say. Dan, welcome to the show.
John, thank you for having me so much on your podcast. I'm for the conversation today.
I'm excited too, man. But before we dive in, because my gut says let's dive in, let's get to it, but I want to give the listeners an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you, your background, and what you're up to today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've spent my entire 20-year career in software. I started out more on the value creation side than the value capture side. So it's one way we think about, product development versus the monetization world. So it's first as an engineer and then engineering management. But ultimately, I became fascinated by how the products we built created value for customers and turned into dollars and cents for the business. And this interest led me to pursue my MBA. I didn't realize it then, but I was quite lucky with my MBA. Most schools, I didn't find out till later, don't have. First of all, the school I went to had a very strong and is known for its marketing program, but most programs don't even have pricing courses. And so got my theoretical grounding in pricing there. And then during that internship during my MBA program, ended up working for a very successful Silicon Valley startup and help solve some pricing challenges that they were having. I'm happy to dive into that. The TLDR of that is don't go freemium. And then after Kellogg, I spent much more time getting deep into value creation side of the business as a product manager. And at the companies I was at, we acquired a lot of other companies and products. And so I gained tremendous experience from seeing all the mistakes that those acquired companies made in their pricing and product strategies. And now I have the privilege of helping founders, CEOs, and their teams build sustainable businesses, helping them get their products in the hands of as many customers as possible and hopefully making money along the way.
This is why we booked an hour because I feel like there's so much we could dive into. But before we do, I just want to call out that I find it super fascinating that you started out as an engineer because a lot of engineers turn into product managers. Like that feels like a pretty common path. But to go all the way from engineer to like you mentioned, value creation to value capture, and then into the pricing side, which I would typically think falls into like the product marketing kind of go to market function. Every company's different, but like that feels like a pretty big spectrum swing. What's the TLDR story of that? What got you interested in making that shift over?
Well, I think the MBA program in general is not school specific, but is a good way to sort of explore what other alternatives are available to you. And so I
Mm-hmm.
remember when I was first thinking about applying for a business school, it was like, well, I've been in this engineering role for how many years now, and that decision was made by a 16 or 17-year-old when he decided what major he wanted to have in college. And so let me go see what else is available. And a business school program and a 2-year MBA program is a pretty society condoned way of going through that career exploration and be like, okay, do I want to go into investment banking or into consulting or into switching functions within my industry or switching industries? So I was able to dabble around with a lot of that. And then, as you mentioned, I do believe product marketing generally should own pricing. We may talk about this later, but that internship I had was technically a product marketing internship. And it was sort of a roll your own. So we got some amount of dabbling in the product management world as well. But that's one of the reasons why I got the freemium project kind of put on my plate. And then so I just had those fundamental backgrounds in marketing from my program. And then, yeah, as I grew in my product management career, there was a lot of these pricing projects, et cetera, that would come up, and product marketing at the company I started with out of school, they technically own pricing, but a lot of them had never got any training in pricing. And so they were like, I believe product management, product marketing should be joined at the hip. They're a dynamic duo. They should be working together to make the product successful. There's not one that's ahead of the other necessarily. But so my counterpart would be like, well, I don't know what to do here. Do you know what to do here? I'd be like, well, I think so. Let me try. And I made a bunch of mistakes trying to apply a theory where it wasn't suited and getting those bruises along the way. And so it just was a natural evolution as far as that goes.
That's pretty cool. I always love hearing people's career journeys and how like the winding paths of our lives take us to where we ultimately are. It's just fascinating. So, thanks for sharing.
Of course.
All right, so diving into pricing. So we we got kind of a glimpse into your start into the pricing world, from engineer to engineering manager to business school to product management to product marketing, and that kind of led into this whole new realm of like developing this expertise that is pretty rare, to your point. Like there's not a lot of companies that have people in house that are good at pricing, and often go to consultants because not a lot of companies just build that muscle internally. So I know there's a couple of things that we wanted to talk about that we're probably going to touch on later that you mentioned earlier, but just to lay the foundation, what do most companies get wrong about pricing? Like what are some of the big myths or some of the big pitfalls that you see typically happen when you step in to
Oh man, there's too many to mention, but I think
help?
that one of the most common I see is when it comes especially to SaaS pricing, most executives think that what you charge will determine your success. In fact, who and how you charge determines your success. There's too many companies that come to me and they're focused purely on what I would term the price level. So is, this product is $20 a seat, it's $100 a seat, it's 19.95. Should we use charm pricing, end at 95 cents or 99 cents? It's like, look, those are fun questions, but you're starting in the totally wrong place. Like eventually we'll have to answer that question, but it's the least impactful in my opinion, and it's the easiest thing to change. And so I really think when it comes to pricing, you spend most of your time on what the price tag goes on and little time on what number goes on the actual price tag.
So figuring out what you put that price on, are you inferring, like, what are you basing that pricing on in terms of like a value metric, or like what I guess can we go a level deeper there on what you meant by that?
Yeah, so there's kind of two components there. So it's again not what you charge, but who and how you charge. So we could take each of those sort of separately, and this might lead us into some of the other topics that we want to discuss. But the who we charge is this idea that we have to understand at a core level our customer segmentation. Not all customers are equal. They will value the product differently depending upon their context, their available competitive alternatives, their needs, motivations, etc. And so understanding that at a fundamental level is critically important. When we think about the how we charge, oftentimes in this conversation, we'll talk a lot about pricing, but when I say pricing, I mean pricing and packaging. It gets a little unwieldy to constantly say pricing and packaging, so we might just say pricing. But the packaging is really the how you charge, and I'm happy to break it down more. But packaging in the SaaS world really has four separate components. Of one is the price metric. So it's the unit value you charge for, your offer bundles or configurations. That's what sets of features go in which offer. Often in SaaS can be something along the good, better, best, or more modular design, or base plus add-ons, depending upon what's most suitable for your market. It could be your price model. So is it a subscription? Is it a perpetual license? Is it a utility billing, pay as you go type models, of dynamic pricing like Google and Facebook have for their ad inventory? And then finally, your sets of price fences. These are how do we charge two different customers two different prices based upon some other criteria, usually identity, time, or volume. And so those components are critically important because they help convey your value story. Like if you're doing pricing right, you're understanding your value at a deep level, and then those pieces of packaging all support the story that you're telling to your customers of how you're going to help them do your job, how the pricing scales with it. It allows you to capture value fairly, as the account size changes, as the customer is getting more value. So it makes the entire go-to-market machine much more efficient. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on a couple things that I think are highly correlated, of segmentation and value, right? And I can't tell you how many times I've had in my product career where it's like, hey, we're going to go after, let's just say, small businesses. And it's like, okay, give me more. And they're like, more what? I'm like, how do you define small business? They're like, oh, 50 to 100 employees. I'm like, is it 50 or is it 100? There's so many implications to the nuances and differences of what segment of customer you're going after that impacts probably what the value is, but also like what is the product that we build to support that segment? Because if I'm building for, let's say, the healthcare vertical versus a construction vertical, those are probably be two wildly different products, at least enough to make a significant difference.
No, absolutely. And I think what you're hinting at there is there's really a couple of different ways to think about segmentation. So at the end of any segmentation exercise, really what you need to understand is two different things: who customers are and what do they want.
Yep.
And then there's two ways to get at that based upon which of those do we start with? Because at the end, we need both. So what most people do is they start with who customers are. And that is what your example just outlined, which is like, we're going to do a firmographic based segmentation based upon employee size or revenue or industry vertical. I am actually in favor of that to an extent, because what I don't want our wonderful product manager leaders who are listening to get themselves into, which I've got myself into before, is you go do a beautiful value-based segmentation and you come back to the executive room and they don't even believe in the concept of customer segments. So I think a firmographic segmentation is a really nice, low cost, low effort way to help executives understand that the market is not all the same and that they have different situations, contexts, needs, but you don't have to go do all the dirty work. The problem with a firmographic or what they call an a priori segmentation, a priori is a fancy Latin term, meaning sort of what comes before, because the a priori part of it is that you didn't devise, there's already a bunch of data out there, whether it's the CIA fact book on demographics or, other Gartner reports, right, that have broken up by industry classifications, but that doesn't necessarily determine the buying criteria that customers have that dictate their purchase decisions. And so you can be led down a false path by getting lulled into this. Well, like SMB customers are different than mid-market, which are different than enterprise. Maybe, but maybe not. Like, so for example, I had a client who they were a incubator company inside of a giant, like, global 100 firm. Right? Now they acted like a seed or Series A startup, because the business leader in that organization had needs of like, hey, this is what we're doing to iterate, and I'm trying to figure out what the value propositions are, or what willingness to pay is, and had no market data. The product was in beta, right? Had no transactions. So if I made that mistake, it was like, it came at them, it was like, oh, well, you're an enterprise company. This is where we're going to start our pricing engagement, with this assumption that there's this giant team and all this data. Will just be entirely incorrect. Like, they were in a different space, but they were inside of a much larger company. So we can get really lulled down that path. So I mentioned the a priori segmentation. The better way to do it is to start with what customers want. And that is ultimately, we call it a post hoc segmentation or a value-based segmentation, because if we do that, we really get to the bottom of why it is that customers buy. And for pricing, it gives us why they value our product a certain amount, which we need to make sure in this, I'm sure we'll get to it in more depth in this conversation, but ultimately the pricing that we put in place, the value story we're telling with our packaging and the price level has to align with that value. And so if we don't do that up front, I've gone the other direction, where you leave segmentation to the very end. And what ends up happening invariably is you end up in an executive room where you're saying, this is what our pricing and packaging should be. And then it's everyone's turn to throw rocks, and they're not throwing literal rocks. What they're throwing is the rock with a name of a specific customer that they have in mind of why that plan won't work for them, because you didn't do the work up front to help the group define what the segments were that we were going to define packages for. So you end up having to do the work all over again. This is the sad fact of it.
No, totally. It's interesting because I've seen it too, where it's like, oh, well, these companies have this much revenue or this many employees, or they have this many customers if they're like an enterprise company that they're serving other businesses, right?
Mhm.
And it's like, Okay, but to your point, the needs of those companies, you could have a company that serves, 30,000 small businesses and another company that serves 10 million, and they have the exact same needs. And then you could have two that have the same customer profile and makeup that have wildly different needs. But to your point, I agree. Like what really matters is what value do they place on, not that's the inverse. What what value should your product produce based on the pains or needs that they have as a business?
Yeah, their context is decisive, right?
Yeah,
So you could have people in very what ostensibly out from the outside look like very similar circumstances, but you talk about their specific context, it looks very different. And you do need to eventually, like I said, you at the end of a segmentation exercise, you do need to have both, because in order to make a segmentation actionable, right, we do need to try to profile the value-based segmentation with ways that allow our go-to-market teams to reach those customers, right? So at the end of it, right, we may attach firmographics or geographies or employee size or revenue count to those value-based segmentations, but we're going to have a much more nuanced view than like, oh, well, this is how Gartner divides our industry, so of course this is the way that our customers want to buy our specific product. It tends to not work exactly that way.
totally. And not to go down this rabbit hole, but I think competitive analysis works the same way too, where people who you view as your competitors might not actually be part of that decision calculus of your potential customers because of the way that like you position your product and based on like the contextual need of the business. They may see something else completely. Like the common expression is like everyone competes with a spreadsheet. It might be something like that where there's things that don't seem to be in the same competitive landscape, but they are part of the potential customer's decision calculus nonetheless.
Yeah, I love that. I use that example a lot myself. The other one I'll use is that Facebook competes with cigarettes, where I'm sitting at my computer, or maybe if I was a smoker, I was sitting at my computer and I don't like whatever it is I'm working on, and I'm getting this itch to do something, and so I could either open up another Chrome tab and go check Facebook or Instagram or TikTok for 15 minutes, or I go outside and smoke a cigarette. Either way, as the end user, I'm scratching that same fundamental social or emotional itch that I have, but with two very different products. And so this sort of leads into a conversation. The ultimate sort of answer I end up getting is like, well, how do you sort of go about a value-based segmentation? I'm a big fan of the jobs to be done approach. So jobs to be done, if we understand sort of customers' context, because the customer's context is decisive, not necessarily the person, right? And I think this is really the beauty of I teach product strategy for Kellogg now for their executive education program. And I have to do a lot of exorcism around what is the difference between a job story and a user story, because most people who have been trained only in a Scrum, like this is how we write user stories, are completely captivated by starting with a persona. But persona tends to not be decisive for design. It tends to be more the context. Now, if you do it right, you could eventually generate a persona based upon those job stories if you go through the full process. But if you just start with, Sally entrepreneur, Betty mid-market, Emily enterprise, it's like you're starting with something that is, I guess it fulfills the Scrum criteria, but it doesn't really help your team actually make progress in building a better product for their market.
It's completely arbitrary.
Correct.
Yeah. So I guess double clicking on before we get into value based pricing, is there anything you would add to like further defining value outside of um, the the user's context?
Yeah, so I use value. I use two different frameworks to think about value. So the first is jobs to be done, and I really like sort of Tony Ulwick's methodology, where he thinks in terms of job story really helps you understand, right, the customer's context, their motivation, and the outcome that they're trying to achieve. And so we think in terms of raw value. There's really three types of value, and which maps to the three types of job stories And so those are, a functional job, a functional or sometimes called an economic job, right? So this is, I want to help, increase revenue, decrease cost, decrease operating capital, increase optionality, decrease risk, better, faster, cheaper, right? Those are economic or functional outcomes. There's emotional outcomes. So this is making someone, have less anxiety or less stress or feel higher status, feel like they have access to expertise, right? And then there's the idea of social jobs. So one of the ideas is that humans are not purely out for ourselves. We're pro-social, and so things like if you're in a nonprofit or government organization, you might be fighting for climate policy or equal rights or access to education or healthcare or whatever it might be, right? So these are benefits or outcomes that you benefit from, but it's because they're pro-social and not directly related to you. So we think about that as a fundamental level, right? Jobs to be done helps us understand, and I call those generally value drivers: the economic, functional, emotional, social. Those are our three core value drivers. And then what I layer on there is another framework that it comes from a gentleman who wrote a seminal book on pricing called The Strategy and Tactics of Pricing. His name's Tom Nagel. And he really, it's a really dense read, but if you're at all interested in the space, it's sort of a must read for anyone who's going to go into the pricing world, because he really did a lot to sort of solidify a lot of these concepts. And he has this concept of the value cascade. The value cascade, if we think about, is not a visual medium, so I'll try to describe to your listeners as best as I can. If I just think about a cascading bar chart, so the highest bar on the left would be what we call use value. So use value would be the sum of all benefits that a customer would get from using your product. And that would be contained in the economic, emotional, and social value that we described before. So that's useful, but for pricing exercise, it's pretty much irrelevant, because as soon as we get into we get into this realm of competition and competitive alternatives. This is another reason, kind of on the jobs to be done front, I really like it, because it does allow you to think in terms of indirect competitors, the spreadsheet or Facebook versus cigarette example. So let me give you an example of how the difference between use value and exchange value comes up. So what I want to try to understand is that the customer exists in a market, and there are other ways for them to get that job done, and those jobs already have prices. Okay, so let's use the pure example of use value. So Gilligan's Island. Gilligan and his crew are trapped on a desert island. Mr. Howell was the millionaire, and that was back in the 60s, so probably adjusted for inflation, he's probably a billionaire in today's terms. So basically Elon Musk is trapped on a desert island, right? And a boat shows up finally after years. Mr. Howell / Elon should be willing to pay every penny he is worth to get off that island, because his money is effectively useless on the island. And so his value should be every penny he could get, and probably all the money he could borrow as well. Just get me off this island. Now, what happens when ship captain B shows up? Now ship captain B says, well, Mr. Howell, I mean, I know you're about to write him a check for $1 billion to get off this island, but I'll give it to you for $1 million. So now the use value didn't change. He still has the benefit of getting off the island, but now we're in a competitive environment. And so now the ship captains are in this dynamic where, okay, one's going to charge me $1 billion, the other one's going to charge me $1 million. Well, it's the same trip home, so the market price is now $1 million. Now the other ship captain has to be like, well, actually, my cabin is bigger, it has better amenities. I'll make you cocktails as we cruise along, And so this is what we call as differentiated value. So the idea here is that you might be positively or negatively differentiated from your competitives, but you have to understand, for the purpose of our pricing exercise, what is your customer comparing you to? What is your next best competitive alternative? And then how are you positively or negatively differentiated from them? And there's a whole science behind how to go through that type of exercise. And then the final part of the value cascade is perceived value. So the context the customer's in and your ability to communicate the value of your product influences the value of your product in the customer's mind. Only perceived value creates willingness to pay. So although you might be able to convince your or run a spreadsheet that says, hey, Mr. Customer, our enterprise CRM system will help you and your sales team generate an incremental $1 million a year in revenue. That number only matters as much as it matters to the person you're talking to. And so now it enters into the psychology and information of the prospect, because customers or prospects may be uninformed about the relevant alternatives or differentiating benefits or attributes of either your product or the alternatives in the space, right? Like we sit as product managers, as pricing leaders in our market, in our product, day in, day out, doing competitive research. We know, there's 250 features our competitor has, and we know when they ship 251, right? Because we're on that. Your prospect is not nearly that deep, right? They got tasked by their manager to go look at some CRM. Hey, we need a CRM system. So they went to G2 Crowd or Trust Radius or whoever, and they pulled, a list of the top 5. And then they went and asked 5 friends at other companies, hey, who do you guys use? What do you like? What do you don't? And now they're on a call with your salesperson, and now they're having a pricing conversation, right? That's the extent of their research, right? And they obviously, different elements of a buying center might have, more or less information, but your ability to justify your value to them, right, is really what dictates the final value. And then that is what they will base their willingness to pay on. So that's sort of, I'll stop there, see where you want to dig into, but that's kind of how I think about value in general.
No, willingness to pay is definitely where I wanted to go. So um, values based on the context that the user or the buyer is in, the pain that is being that is generating the push to find a solution or uh, a way to do that job. But there's also other ways that they're probably trying to do that job today, and so um, there's a competitive market that is driving like what that reasonable cost should be, and creating kind of that, I guess, that heuristic in the buyer's mind of what is reasonable to pay for this solution, right? So like your example of Gilligan's Island, if there's just one ship captain, it's a billion because you want to get off the island. But as soon as you have 2 ship captains and the other one sets the value at 1 million, it kind of shifts the mental model of the market and what we should pay, unless you can convince that there's a valid reason why they should pay more for it. So did I
That's
track that well?
that is a beautiful summary. Well
Okay,
done.
thank you. So as you're understanding the value and the competitive alternatives, even if they're indirect competitors, like I it feels like you could get a sense of that willingness to pay, or at least the temptation would be to say, I can get a sense of the willingness to pay without having to talk to customers. Well, what would you say to that, and what potential caution would you throw to those who think that way?
Oh man. Ah. So if there's one thing I will tell any product manager or pricing person is you have to talk to your customers. There's no you are not doing your job as it's like it'd be like talking to a painter who never picks up a paintbrush. I don't know what they're doing with their time, but you're not a painter. Like you call yourself a painter, but you're not a painter. Maybe it would be no offend Banksy in this conversation. He actually qualify. Well, he's an artist, right? He's not a painter. I don't know if anyone would call him that, but you ultimately you do have to talk to your customers. Man, there's so many directions I could go with that question. Is there, I guess, what would be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of 2 directions I could take it. There's an existing market, meaning there's multiple players who are solving a problem in a market, that have gotten adoption to some degree within that market, and you're trying to enter that market and compete within it. So that's one direction we could go, or it could be kind of the blue ocean scenario where there may be one other alternative, but there's really not much else out there, and so there's not a real good baseline or benchmark to set your pricing at. It feels like The second scenario is kind of an obvious, you should talk to your customers, but it feels like the temptation to just look at the market and price accordingly or price similarly is more of a temptation in kind of an established market.
Got it. So, yeah, I think the first part you said about a blue ocean, uh, I mean, I know that book did really well and got a bunch of marketers really excited, but I kind of think it's a false hope. It's a mirage, especially in this environment. If you're a software developer, the ability to spin up a company, spin up a product has never been cheaper, and it's getting insanely better all the time. Between all the AI tools now I'm seeing are generating wireframes all the way to code. You got all these no code solutions. So, while you might have been in a possible blue ocean 15 years ago in SaaS, I do not think that that's even a viable option today. And I will say, even if that's the case, your next best competitive alternative is the customer status quo. It's what they're doing today. We talked about this at the beginning. Is it email and spreadsheets? Okay, well then what is your differentiating value versus that solution? If they've got Johnny the intern who's updating a spreadsheet, okay, well, sometimes Johnny's out sick. Sometimes Johnny makes a mistake. Sometimes Johnny puts the spreadsheet on a shared public drive and exposes all of our company secrets to the entire world, right? That's a security risk. So what is your Johnny's like generally effective, but there's going to be better things to do when once you make software that's automated, right? So it's about understanding that. On the other side, I think this kind of leads us into the conversation of, if you're in a heavily contested market, I'm selling CRMs. Why don't I just go look at what Salesforce has and then look at, I don't know who else is in that market, but like look at Salesforce and I'll just discount, 20% to whatever Salesforce has. And I would be lying if that's not what a lot of companies do. And I don't think that's a good thing to do. What I think brings into this discussion is there's this concept of pricing orientations that I think is quite helpful to understand. And the way I think about pricing orientations is they're a ladder of pricing competency. Really an orientation, as I think about, is how is pricing done around here? What are the things that we really take into consideration or account as we're making our pricing and packaging for our products? So they go by the 3 C's of pricing, because marketing, we love our handy acronyms. So it's cost-based pricing, competition-based pricing, and customer value-based pricing. Last one, often just called value-based pricing, but again, we love our 3 C's. So we have 2 C's and a V is not quite as catchy. So each of those it's a ladder. It's not, we just get to jump. I think that one of the biggest disconnects I get around value-based pricing is, I'll have companies come and be like, oh, we want to do value-based pricing. And I'll be like, great. What are your cost of goods sold? What are your marginal costs for serving a customer? And they're like, well, we don't have that. I'm like, well, you don't get to go to value-based pricing, because you need that too. You need to understand your costs. You need to understand your competition to actually execute value-based pricing well, because those create barriers or the ends of your ranges in what is acceptable pricing. Like, we have to understand what our cost to serve is, so we don't go out of business. If profits have a dirty sort of aura among technologist founders. I think this is one of the reasons why freemium is so popular, because they're just like, oh, I don't know what to charge. Money is bad, right? But like, look, if you fundamentally believe that you're increasing the amount of value and benefits in the world, like, that means your company should exist for long enough. And for your company to continue to exist, you need to be profitable. So we need to understand our cost to serve. We need to understand our unit economics. That needs to be set a floor for what our viable pricing should be. Then we get to your example, which is, and there's better and worse ways for each of these to do, like cost-based pricing or competition-based pricing. But competition-based pricing, right, is like, at least it gets us to the point that we recognize that, first of all, customers don't care about our costs. So if we're just sitting there if the CFOs are sitting there looking at a spreadsheet, determining what margin they want to have, well, it's interesting, but the customer doesn't, that rationale they don't care how big your AWS infrastructure bill is every month, right? Or how much you're paying your engineers. It's irrelevant to them. I've never once bought a piece of software and said, how many engineering hours did it take to build this? Like, I don't care. It's not my problem. Like, I've got problems I'm hoping you could solve. Like, your costs are completely irrelevant to me. Anyway, end rant. So competition-based pricing allows us to get to at least inhabit the same universe as our customers, right? So we have a sense of, what our position is in the market, what is the unique benefits or that we offer compared to alternatives. And yes, you can. It's not the end of the world, especially if you're just starting, to go sort of, you know, let's say be inspired by your competition's pricing. But you have to get that insight in order to understand, where, are you playing in the same ballpark as, are we playing the same game, right? Because like, let's use a sports analogy. Like, if your customers are playing baseball and then you show up with a hockey stick, they're gonna be like, wait, this makes no sense, right? So we have to be at least playing the same game and be in the realm of understanding what's going on in our customers' reality. And that's what competition-based pricing. But then I think when we get to value-based pricing, this is really like understanding at a fundamental level what it is that our customers really care about, how we uniquely or differentially solve those problems better than other competitors, right? Because I think the lazy competition-based pricing is, well, Salesforce is the industry leader, so everyone should be at least a 20% discount to them because they're more mature and they're sort of got this brand. And I think it's fundamentally lazy. I think the other problem is, look, pricing is a core growth lever for the business. I don't know any CEO that would outsource their demand gen strategy, their product strategy, but they're more than willing to just say, oh yeah, well, like competitor XYZ, why don't you tell me what I should price? Like, it's a major opportunity, right? They wouldn't do that for any other critical growth avenue of their business. But yet I think it's fundamentally lazy to just do that, right? So you need that information, but you shouldn't stop there at the end of the day.
No, completely agree. We've been having some willingness to pay conversations recently for a 0 to 1 product that we're launching at Lindio, and it's been fascinating to hear the assumptions that we've made, whether it's myself or others internally, about the value that companies would place on things or how we could model pricing, and that then to actually have those conversations and to hear the feedback that we get, and it's two different worlds. So like I'm a huge fan of like assumption mapping and testing assumptions, and I think pricing is one of those big ones where when you decide to take the lazy route and just price according to what the competitive landscape is, that one assumption could be pretty detrimental.
Agreed.
Cool. So kind of diving into willingness to pay a little bit more. So let's say somebody's listening and they're like, okay, I'm going to stop being lazy. I'm going to listen to the advice that Dan's giving. I'm actually going to go and have conversations with customers and actually do that work. I'm going to ask a really big question. What does that look like when done well? And maybe we can start unpacking that from like, or what's the first step they should take in terms of like trying to assess willingness to pay?
Big questions. This could be like an 8-week course. So first of all, I will say, I do not think that any of your listeners are lazy. I know product managers, product leaders work incredibly hard. And one thing I will say is that I was incredibly lucky slash had idiosyncratic experience that led me to where I am today. It is not a road or a skill set that is taught. So I do not, if anything, I think the CEOs that don't think about their P&L in an expanded way are maybe the ones who need a shake. It's not the hard-earned product leaders that are listening to your show, I'm sure. So I think fundamentally, around like measuring willingness to pay, the biggest problem I see is that for some reason pricing got slotted in the go-to-market launch plan checklist of product management, or let's say of company lists. I don't know how this happened, but it's somewhere. It's like, all right, we're launching in 30 days. How do we price and package this thing? I'll say this. You don't have a choice of whether you will have a pricing conversation with your customer. The only decision you get to make is when you will have the conversation. So, let's take this to the extreme. Your sales guy is going to have a pricing conversation to sell the product. Uh, I I feel bad for that sales guy if that's the first time willings to pay or pricing has been brought up. Also, 30 days prior, probably not a good time because the lack of a business case, business thinking around that has been, a continual rock in my shoe, let's say. Ultimately, right, we have to think about any of this research as a process. And I think philosophically, like asking customers about willingness to pay is complex because customers are often irrational or uncertain about product performance or even their own preferences. And even at an individual level, customers can have uncertainty about their willingness to pay. Well, we could price this water bottle anywhere between $0 and $1 trillion. That's probably not where you're starting. You're probably like, well, we probably price it somewhere between, I don't know, $5 and $35, right? So determine what you know now. And then I think what it goes lacking in a lot of these discussions, right? This goes for any research of any variable you're doing, which is what is the value of additional information? So information itself has a value and it has a cost. And what we want to understand is the cost of going and getting more information, is the price of information, is it well worth the value that we're going to get on the other side? And then there's a set of relevant measurement instruments that we can use to go get those and then make a decision and act on it. So fundamentally, that's kind of how we think about thinking about defining a willingness to pay sort of study. The way you sort of go about that is once we have sort of a measurement problem in hand, there's a set of qualitative and quantitative primary research. I do not recommend A/B testing. I think it lacks foundations of good pricing, which good pricing is fair, transparent, and consistent. Generally in B2B, you do not have enough data or visits to your pricing page for statistical significance. It creates a whole bunch of lack of trust or loss of trust between prospects. It makes it really confusing for your sales team because if they're on a call with a prospect, they have no idea what the prospect saw. So generally, like your standard like feature A/B testing, I do not recommend for pricing and packaging changes. Now, there's caveats there. Like sometimes there's elements of your pricing page that is fine to move around. Like we're going to put the most expensive option first, for example, or we're going to change the titles of or the descriptions of the package names or whatever it might be. Like those things you may are fine sort of A/B test, but your fundamental pricing and packaging is not well suited to A/B. And also the problem you run into in subscription and B2B is that it's not a short-term experiment. Like you've got to, first of all, you got to run the test long enough to get statistical significance. Most B2B companies won't have the transaction volume, but then, what is the impact on gross retention, on net retention? You might not get that data for 1 year or more, depending upon if you're selling annual or multi-year contracts. So I'll stop there. See if you want to dig in anywhere in particular.
No, I think you're on a roll. I think this is really good. Are there any, I guess, major distinctions as people listen to this and they hear B2B, they hear SaaS? There's different contexts that the listeners are in, right? Are there any key differentiators or key things that they should be thinking about differently between the two of I don't know, like a SMB to mid-market SaaS play versus like an enterprise type of model?
That's a great question. So the question is specifically staying within the B2B realm, not like B2B versus B2C.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. So, there's going to be, it's rare these days to find a mature company that plays only in one of those spaces, right? There's traditional enterprise companies that are trying to make, SMB mid-market, offerings, right? To adopt more PLG type go-to-market models, right? And then you find even the lower end sort of PLG companies, if that's where they start, at some point they add like an enterprise plan. So I don't think at a certain level of maturity, everyone sort of is playing everywhere. I think where you run into major differences is in, we didn't really touch on this, but one of the areas is if I'm playing in just like an enterprise space, right? If I'm selling to the Fortune 100 companies, right, and they're large enterprises, the differences in willingness to pay among those, they could almost be segments within themselves because they value such different things differently. So that may change. For example, if you're publishing your pricing and packaging on your website, or how much of it you're publishing, versus a high end, or not a high end, but a high volume like PLG motion. You want to be very transparent with your pricing and packaging, because it's very expensive for your sales team to have the same pricing conversation of what your list prices are every time they pick up the phone. It's like, first of all, like, I don't want to, if we say our price is $19 per user per month, like someone calls and like, oh, I was hoping it was $1 per user per month. Well, it's like, that was not a good use of your sales team's time, right? And you just increase your customer acquisition cost for someone who wasn't a fit anyway. And so, you may want to have your pricing and packaging published as a almost like a lead qualification or funnel qualification measure. There's going to be there's so many different differences, right? Like it's hard to pinpoint exact. There's probably in an enterprise buying cycle, there's going to be more of a buying center, right? So if you think about your end user champion versus the financial buyer versus procurement, your software support lifecycle team, right? If I'm buying Salesforce, I've got an entire sales operations team that's responsible for making sure that thing runs, creating custom fields, integrating it with other systems in our environment, et cetera. And so each of those stakeholders is going to require different value communication. You're going to have to do different sales enablement to justify your value proposition to each of those type of buyers. So I would say that the enterprise case could get quite complex compared to the more transactional.
Totally makes sense, and I think that's great advice, because that's often debated around, do we show our cost, do we not? But I think that makes a lot of sense, that it really comes back to unit economics and like what makes sense from like how you leverage the resources that you have. And if you have let's say a lower end price point, so to speak, you don't want enterprise sales reps selling $20 subscriptions.
Yes, that's a very inefficient use of their time.
Absolutely. Cool, man. This has been great so far. I know we're getting close to time, but I do want to circle back to something that the listeners have probably been listening to the entire podcast, just to get to that one point you brought up at the very beginning of why should you not do freemium? Because there's so much like quote unquote data out there around like how freemium companies do so much better in the SaaS world and PLG companies do so much better. And I feel like this could be like a hotly debated topic amongst like you and a couple other pricing pros that I've listened to. But I would love your perspective on this, of where have you seen, and maybe it's too aggressive to say freemium sucks in all cases, and maybe you might disagree with that, but I would just love your perspective on where you've seen premium fail, and like your general perspective on freemium as a whole.
Oh man. So yeah, this could be a bloody knuckle debate with a few folks I come to mind. Look, I think fundamentally the better answer anytime. So I think the tactical advice for your product leader listeners is, anytime someone mentions freemium, the better answer almost always is a free trial. Okay. So forever free is, or freemium is a monetization model. And I want to be very clear on what we're thinking about. So because freemium is, free and then upgrade to a premium package. It is not. So some people will be like, oh, well, Facebook is freemium. And it's like, no, Facebook is a two-sided network. Their advertisers are paying the bills, right? You're the product. There's ad supported models. Like I was a big fan of, used Duolingo a ton. Right? And they have free users. they have an ad supported model, right? That's not freemium. That's ad supported. So freemium is this like, no, we just have a bunch of free customers or free users. I make that distinction when we're talking about freemium. So if they're not paying you, they are users. If they're paying you, they are customers. Generally, again, it's better to have a 14 to 30 day free trial instead of freemium. It's a bad idea, except in a few rare cases. Okay. Pareto's rule. 20% of what you build is 80% of the value. If you start off as a technology company being like, well, we're going to give away this features, and you did your job as product leaders and you built the most important things first, congratulations, you just gave away 80% of the perpetual value of your product off the bat in a freemium version. And now you're going to spend the rest of your career at that company trying to build something else that gets people to upgrade and pay. So I think that's first. I think there's an argument. I think it's really disingenuous around there's an illusory improvement to the CAC metric. So CAC is your customer acquisition cost. And I think where the data that you've mentioned, I've seen a bunch of data. Unfortunately, we're not in a academic peer-reviewed study. You got to publish your data sets and your Python notebooks to show us how you arrive at your answers. A lot of these people are pontificating based upon what they were told by a company, and then we put it into a blog post, right? And it's very hard to drive, correlation versus causation. Like, were they successful because they had freemium? What was the counterfactual? Were they able to effectively split, and run just a free trial version versus freemium? And like, they found that one was more successful. Where's their data? Like, I've never seen that. I've looked for it. Believe me, I would love to have it. I would love for someone to come and prove me wrong on that. But CAC may look better, but that's because companies don't usually treat R&D investment as a marketing expense. So effectively what you've done is, because the formula for customer acquisition cost, CAC, is sales and marketing expense divided by the number of customers required. R&D isn't in that calculation. So now what you've done is said, we're gonna take all of these engineers who are in the R&D and the P&L, and we're gonna effectively make them marketing, but you didn't actually move those numbers over into the CAC. So of course it's going to make CAC look better. Like, it's just fun with math. Like, you've done an Enron. Well, they'll just bury the costs over in the shell company. Like, it's silly. Look, I think it caused a bunch of problems internally. It's fundamentally really difficult to move customers from free. You run into what is called the penny gap. You might as well. So the penny gap is, if I go from free to 1 cent, that's an infinite increase in price. Anyone who's gone through, I'm not going to do the derivation here, but that's check the math textbooks. I'm pretty sure that's correct. So it's just as challenging to move someone from free as it is from a net new. The illusion is that you'll have, first of all, it requires a massive market to work. So we're talking on Zoom right now, right? COVID happened. Zoom is one of these examples that actually works, but in general, right, it has network effects. And also, everyone during COVID could be a customer. So like, it made sense for them to have freemium, but like, they have a massive TAM and a massive number of possible accounts. Best in class freemium companies, they can about 1 to 3% of their customers actually go to paid. So, for most B2B companies, they don't have millions or billions of potential clients like in their TAM. And so, and this illusion even that the other 99% of the free users are going to become customers, it constantly tempts executives. Look, I give all benefit of the doubt to the growth teams and CMOs out there. Like, they have a really hard job. And so there's this mirage of like, look at all these users. Like, if only we could build this one more thing that they're all saying we should use, but it's absolutely that. It's a mirage. And so it causes a lot of conversations internally that are dysfunctional, not helpful. You end up investing a lot of effort into it. Requires basically adds a momentum tax on every single feature that you build. So when does it work? It requires a colossal market, specific competitive environment where like the dominant player gives away or their product or bundles it with other offerings. I think this was when I was doing this research originally back in 2011, Evernote was the big 300, 800 pound gorilla in the free, believe me, I read all the blog posts back then about like, Evernote's the champion. Look at all their stuff with doing your freemium. Well, look, they were up against Microsoft and Microsoft OneNote, which was the same exact product, except you got it for free with the Microsoft Office suite. So they were competing against free. Like if you're competing effectively free, right? And look, Slack had to run into the arms of Salesforce because Microsoft did the same thing with Microsoft Teams, where they bundled it into the enterprise, and all of a sudden Slack's like, well, we got no more growth, right? So let's run it, and everyone talks about Slack's like amazing freemium strategy. It's like, yeah, no, it works until Microsoft enters your space, right? Or only if Microsoft enters your space, we should say. Some of the developer focused products, like, if a product has to be used in dev staging by teams like long before use in production, instead of like, look, those aren't viable leads. Like the sales guys giving free trial extensions every 7 to 14 days. It's like, hey man, like we'll just use this thing and whatever. Like I can't use whatever you're giving me in production. It would never, like our system would crash, and like it's too, like I would never try to work around using your free offering in production, because everything would fail. So there's a couple of situations where it works. Like at Slack, like there's a built-in community aspect where it actually is required for like everyone. You almost have this like more two-sided marketplace cold start problem with Slack, where everyone has to jump into the tool for it to be effectively useful. It's not useful if everyone's not collaborating off the bat. And so it made sense in that case to really lower the activation energy. But yes, generally, if you come up against freemium, the better answer is a 14 to 30 day free trial for sure.
Cold Start Problem is a good book, by the way. But I agree. It's been something where, like, outside of my day job, I have kind of side products that I've been building, and it's been something I've been spinning my wheels on and experimenting with. Do we just make it a paywall to get in? Do we, like, how much do we give if they come in for free and then try to upgrade? So but as I think through some of the examples that you gave, both kind of in side stuff that I'm doing and in my day job, it's like, okay, that definitely makes sense. And I think we've seen it, right? It's these companies get all kind of praise because they grow their user base because of freemium, and it's like, oh, now their valuation is so high because sure, they should figure out how to monetize the millions of users they have now. And it's like crickets on monetization. And then unless they can continue to be arbitrarily propped up by VC money, like you said earlier, if you can't make money, you can't serve any customers because you run out of business.
Yeah, or you have to go run into the arms of an acquirer. So
exactly. And hope that they don't figure out that you don't know how to monetize the product either. Good stuff. Well, Dan, this has been awesome, man. I know we could probably go another hour or more hours on a lot of these topics, but there was so much gold to take away from this, and I really appreciate you joining. But before we go, for the users who are listening and are like, man, Dan's really smart about this pricing stuff, and I have questions, where could they find you or reach out to you?
yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you having me on, John. And I don't want to make this sound like I got all this handed down on stone tablets. I made a lot of mistakes along the way. So as I said before, there's not a real easy way to learn this. So I try to blog fairly regularly on my website, producttranquility.com, all one word, and help demystify this world for others. So folks can find me there, or just ways to contact me through my website, or reach out to me at Dan Balcauski on LinkedIn, and just let me know that you heard me on the podcast so I could separate it from the rest of the LinkedIn spam.
Awesome. Well, I'll put all those links in the show notes. And again, I appreciate your time. This was awesome.
Thank you so much.